Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It was not a bet. It was not a scheme. It was not a con. It was none of those things. And the reason we are here today is not because the government brought an indictment. The reason we are here today is because Mr. Guo has pleaded not guilty to the indictment, and the evidence in this case will show, all of the evidence, the witnesses that they bring in, as government counsel noted, one by one, the documents that come in one by one, will lead you to only one conclusion, and the conclusion is that Mr. Guo is not guilty of the 12 counts brought in this indictment. I am here to tell you why there is no conspiracy, RICO or otherwise, and there is no enterprise. Mr. Guo is not guilty of the charges in this indictment. Before I do that, and before I speak more to what the evidence will show in this case, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Sabrina Shroff. And I, along with my colleagues, represent Miles Guo. Miles Guo is one of 8 children who started life with very little, born and raised in China, and that is in fact where he and his brothers and his family made a fortune in real estate. The evidence in this case will show that the fortune was humongous. And yes, the government would like you to draw many negative inferences from a person who, according to them, spent thousands of dollars on a TV or on a mattress. I ask you please, when you consider the evidence within the context and not to be drawn in by the government's invitation to make judgment calls about people who have money and spend it in a way that you and I simply wouldn't. So let's talk about what the evidence in this case will show. The evidence in this case will show how Miles Guo, filled with a determination to accomplish a goal, he had a goal, and how he worked on that goal over a period of years, and the goal was to establish, to set up, to form, and to move forward a movement that would allow the people of China, the Chinese people, to know that there was an alternative to the Chinese Communist Party, and how the Chinese Communist Party could be removed so that everybody could live in a way that they chose to live. Mr. Guo, the evidence will show, did not have criminal intent, and when the evidence in this case is complete, you will see that what the government is trying to string together is not just a group of people to try and prove to you an existence of a conspiracy that really doesn't exist, but also asking you to make value judgments about how money is made and how money is spent. So let me start where the government had started. Let me talk about what the government spent the majority of the time today, and what the government will spend a majority of the time throughout this case on, the one person they ask you to convict, Miles Guo. He was raised in China, one of 8 boys, and each one of them grew up from nothing and made a fortune in real estate. The real estate fortune of the 8 brothers in China was not just worth millions, it was worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And you will hear that despite this incredible success, financial fortune that he had in China, Mr. Guo left China and came eventually and settled down in New York. And you will ask yourself, and the evidence will show why Mr. Guo left China. He left China because he'd taken on the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and they were not pleased with him at all. The Chinese Communist Party also had a goal, and they were very determined to make sure their goal was met. Their goal was to make sure Miles Guo stopped speaking about the CCP. Now you've heard from government counsel earlier today, and he has certainly invited you to make moral judgments, value judgments, all sorts of judgments, but what he has asked you to do at his core, he's asked you to receive from him almost a fiat that Mr. Guo lied. He wants you to accept that Mr. Guo lied so that people would give him money, and then wants you to accept that the only thing he did with that money is spend it on himself and his family. That is not this case, is not true. You are going to hear that, like almost every one of us, there's more than one aspect to Miles Guo, and some of the aspects and some of the things you will hear during the testimony in this case will be both surprising and eye-opening. So when you evaluate the evidence that comes in through the witnesses, when you think about Miles Guo's story, when you think about who Miles Guo is, I ask you, keep in mind and conceptualize the world that he lived in because it is not our world. Our world is not filled with surveillance, constant harassment, and constant oversight and disruption by the Chinese Communist Party. You will hear testimony in this case from government witnesses that Mr. Guo was forced to leave China. He was forced to leave behind his wife and his daughter. Both were arrested and detained in prisons in China for almost 2 years. You will learn and you will have evidence that shows you that once Mr. Guo got to New York, instead of focusing on all the negatives that were before him and all the hurdles he had to face, what he did is, he started to and continued over time to speak out against the Chinese Communist Party, and that is what he did all the time, all day long. That was his goal, to get that story out. And repeatedly he said, and you will hear it through the trial, that the people of China are not the Communist Party. That is what he wanted to tell the people that were here in the United States and the good-thinking people that he had to leave behind in China. What is it that he set out to do? He set out to start a movement and tell the truth about the CCP. And with that, he started to speak, he started to write, and he started to broadcast, and soon that came to be known amongst those who believed him and amongst those who followed him to be the whistleblower movement. And what did he talk about? He talked about things that he knew. He knew of the corruption in the CCP, and that's what he talked about. He knew certain secrets of corrupt government officials, and that's what he talked about, specifically. What else did he know? He knew the many ways in which the CCP worked, and he knew of the many, many ways that the CCP could make one's life hell, and one's professional life, and one's business life, and one's personal life. Now once Mr. Guo started talking about the CCP, the reaction to it was immediate and strong, and the reaction wasn't just from the people who were enthralled by what he had to say. There was another reaction too. There was a reaction by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and they too had a goal. Their goal was to make sure that he stopped. So you see that most vividly when Mr. Guo, and the evidence will show, had a broadcast on April 19th of 2017, when he starts and gives a live interview on Voice of America. In face of relentless bullying by the CCP to stop, to be quiet, Mr. Guo decided to have a live feed interview on April 19th. The interview was, and his goal was, to broadcast in an uncensored, live manner so that nobody could doctor what he had to say. And what happened to this live interview? While he's still speaking, in mid-speech, the feed is cut off, the line is cut off, and the interview is stopped. There is no warning. There is no notice. All of a sudden, all of the work he had put in to make sure this interview goes through, it's cut off. And what happens after that? What happens after that also gives you a context about the world in which Mr. Guo has to live and do business. Immediately after the April 19th interview, the Chinese Communist Party issues what is called a red notice. That is, a red notice is a warrant through the Interpol, seeking Mr. Guo's immediate arrest and extradition back to China. After that interview with Voice of America, his wife and his daughter are arrested in China by the Chinese police. He loses all access to social media. His YouTube account is cut off. His Twitter is cut off. And he has no access whatsoever to any methodology by which he can get his word out. What else do they cut off access to? They cut off access to any method by which he could get himself or his businesses any help. The CCP hacked his phones. Every cell phone he has, they hacked. They hacked his computers, his home computers, and his work computers. They even hacked the home and work computers of other people who are either assisting him or doing business with him. And this pattern of harassment by the CCP, and the evidence will show, all of this pattern escalates and becomes more and more sophisticated. So let me give you an example of how sophisticated this harassment can get. At one point, the CCP is so determined to shut down any and every bank account that the CCP starts to send money into these accounts in the names of people who are on the OFAC list. The OFAC list is a list set by the United States government that lists the names of people who have engaged in criminal conduct and are not allowed to use our banking system. The CCP uses those names to send in money, triggers a reaction from the compliance people in the bank shuts down all of his accounts, because the monies being wired, they think, are in the name of known criminals on the OFAC list. You will hear all of this evidence from the government witnesses, and you will know that the CCP has 1,000 different ways to mess with Miles Guo and to try and stop the political movement that was really the essence of his entire being. The evidence will show why Mr. Guo continued in this movement, and why he endeavored to overcome each and every one of these hurdles. He was determined to make sure the movement survived, and he wanted to make sure others who wanted to join the movement were able to do so. So what did Mr. Guo do? He set up the Rule of Law Foundation, and he set up the Rule of Law Society. He dedicated both those entities to make sure that they provided people with support to fight the propaganda given by the CCP. To give voice to the movement, he created a social media company. The government lawyer has spoken endlessly about it. GTV. What was GTV? GTV was a real company set up to spread the message of the whistleblower movement. The point of GTV was to get an uncensored voice out, not to just the people of Chinese beliefs and systems who lived in the United States, but also the many, many people who were left behind in China, who also wanted to be part of that movement. And that is what GTV offered them. Yes, GTV was the first of multiple business opportunities that aimed to spread the voice of the whistleblower movement. Mr. Guo participated in GTV, the Farm Loan Program, G-Clubs, and the Himalaya Exchange, and its currencies, H-Coin and H-Dollar. These businesses were at the heart of the movement, and the government is simply wrong when it argues that they were not real businesses. The evidence in this trial will show that GTV was, unlike many, many others, a citizen-based journalism website. It allowed for people to speak openly and talk to each other without repercussions from the CCP. The Farm Loan Program, the evidence will show, not what this prosecutor has just told you, but it will show that the Farm Loan Program was a way for people to give their money at an interest rate to support the movement that they were interested in. And it was a way for people to earn money from these loans. I remind you, keep an eye on the time frame when all of this happened. The United States and most of the world are in the midst of a pandemic, and people are eager to interact with each other online. What was G-Clubs? G-Clubs was what the government lawyer here mocks, whether or not one should spend X amount of dollars on a sweatshirt or sweatpants. I think he said sweatpants. That is a person's choice, and that is exactly what China didn't want people to have and what the movement did want people to have choice. You want to spend your money that way, that is entirely up to you. And what did G Club's membership allow? It allowed a person, if they wanted, to support the movement at whatever price they wanted to support it. If you wanted to support it at the $10,000 level, you could, and if you wanted to support it at the $50,000 level, you could. The evidence will show, and I ask you, when the evidence comes in, do not take that invitation to make a moral or value judgment on what and how people should spend their money. The question is, does the evidence show the existence of real companies, the existence of real employees, the existence of people who did actual, real good work, the existence of people who dealt with the same problems you and I deal with at our jobs, trying to do the best job we can because we're chosen by people and bosses, because we have talent, expertise, and hard work, and those are the people that worked in each one of these companies. There is no denying that all of these entities were built around Mr. Guo's celebrity. Yes. And he was the one who started speaking as early as 2017 and continued speaking against the CCP. You know what else the evidence will show? That not just other people were the ones who invested. Mr. Guo's friends invested, Mr. Guo's family members invested. Why? Because they too believed in the movement. So they invested. They invested in GTV, they invested in the farm, they invested in G Clubs, and they invested on the Himalaya Exchange. They believed. The evidence will show that these companies were built, were put together, just like any other business, maybe not with the same level of infrastructure, but people believed. And Mr. Guo, like many of us, had a vision, had an idea. What he did not quite have is the infrastructure that you and I bring to our daily lives. When he first started, he spoke very little or no English. He was new to this country. He wasn't familiar with the way things are done. And yes, you will hear recordings in which he speaks in a demanding voice, one instant, for work to get completed, and it sometimes even appears to be extremely pig-headed in a way that many a person is. Does that mean he's a criminal? No. Does that mean he committed these crimes? The evidence will show it does not. What the evidence, again, will show is that the people who he hired were people who were able to contribute to each one of these businesses. Now the government, I suppose, will spend some amount of time introducing evidence about two individuals, Yvette Wang and William G., and I ask you, as you hear the evidence the government puts in, to pay some close attention to what roles each one of these people played. The testimony will show that Ms. Wang was the head of operations. She ran the day-to-day of each business. She was in charge of hiring. She did the best to hire people, and her hiring practices were the same as yours or mine. She hired people that she met along the way in her business, she hired people through a headhunter when she needed a person or a spot filled. And she was no more or no less committed and no more or no less demanding than any other chief executive officer that works. William J. is another name that the evidence will show, and William J. was the finance guy. He's a well-regarded investment banker who had managed the fortune not just of the Guo family fund, but he had managed the fortunes of many other companies. He had expertise, he had skill, and that is why he was the finance guy. And I've already talked at length about Mr. Guo, who was the ideas man. He came up with the ideas and he put together the thought and the vision of what the movement that he believed in would look like. So you see, he wasn't alone in the movement. He wasn't moving all on his own. In fact, that's why it was called the whistleblower movement. The point of it was to have others join and participate. So what will the evidence show at the end of the day? The evidence will show that each one of these companies hired and had people working towards the existence of a real business. They believed, and Mr. Guo believed. Mr. Guo believed in this movement. So when the government lawyer asks you and tells you to believe that Mr. Guo defrauded the members of this movement, what the government is saying to you is that he intentionally misled supporters to steal money, the same money that they had given to the movement that he had devoted almost his entire life to, the movement for which he fled China, the movement for which he put up with being followed every day, the movement for which his phones were hacked, the movement for which his wife and his daughter sat in prison for 2 years, and the movement for which he was not allowed to leave and travel outside the United States, the movement for which he risked his very existence. That's what they're saying he set out to harm. They're saying that he set out to harm the very thing that was almost an extension, a symbiotic extension of who he was. And he did all of that even though he had a fortune from a family fund that allowed him to live in luxury. What the government is asking you to believe is not just illogical. It defies common sense. I ask you to consider this. All of the evidence that the government lawyer talked about the wealth, the millions of dollars worth of luxury hotel in Manhattan where he lived, the yacht, the mattress, whatever it is that he talked about, you know what the evidence is going to show? The evidence is going to show that no matter what else these witnesses say to you, Mr. Guo had that lifestyle long before the government even alleges that he committed this fraud. The suits, sweatpants, the house, the evidence will clearly show that has been his lifestyle for decades, well before the government says he lost money and well before any of this was even a thought in the government's mind. And it certainly continues today and continued for days after because the family fund will always support Mr. Gua. And I ask you to consider this, because the government does invite you to make this value judgment. It is easy for a person to judge another as either shallow or rich, but shallow or rich does not make for a criminal. That does not mean that the government's inference is a proper one. The evidence will clearly show that Mr. Gua did not need to steal money to buy the Brioni suits. None of that would be worth all of the hardship he went through to keep the CCP at bay. What the evidence will show here is that Mr. Gua did not steal money from GTV, he did not steal money from the Farm Loans Program, he did not steal money from G Clubs, and he did not steal money from the Himalaya Exchange. The government will also invite you to think and invite you to conclude that the reason Mr. Gua did certain things are because he was engaged in criminal activity. So what else is the government going to elicit in terms of evidence? The government is going to seek to elicit that Mr. Gua had constant telephones that he changed, he had almost hundreds and hundreds of telephones. And that he had these telephones, and he changed his number constantly because he didn't want people to know what he was doing. I ask you to consider this: if you have been the target of constant hacking by the CCP, and if you have been the target of people listening in on your phones, using your voice recordings to impersonate you, wouldn't you also change your phones that often? If you were in constant fear of being threatened, kidnapped, killed, moved, would you also not have a car that does not tell people where and when you're going to be taken? It's logical that that is what a person who is being surveilled would live in that manner. If you were Mr. Gua and you were being constantly targeted, wouldn't you want a safe and secure place to have business meetings? Wouldn't you establish a base where people you wanted to do business with could come and meet with you without the interference and the distortion from the CCP? For every piece of evidence of wealth that they put in, you will have an equally fair inference that he took those steps not to cheat, not to indulge, but to make sure that the movements survived despite the distortions of the CCP. I ask you to keep in mind when they talk to you about bank accounts, MOA, homes, ask yourself, why would a person have to open a bank account unless, of course, each time a bank account was owned, somebody from the OFAC list deposited money into your account and had compliance to them? That's the reason why Mr. Gua's actions must be evaluated in the context and the lifestyle in which he was supposed to exist. So the government will introduce the evidence. And I ask you to keep in mind that for each piece of evidence that comes into them, the necessary inference from them is not the accurate one. They ask you to infer from the filing of a bankruptcy that Mr. Gua simply did not have money. Now, whether we think it's fair or whether we think it unfair, the rich often declare bankruptcy. Personal bankruptcy does not mean poverty. None of that inference is correct. And I ask you, when you hear evidence of that, to consider how it is that Mr. Gua, who did not have any personal assets at that time, because the CCP was the one that had seized his property. There was a time, and you will hear evidence coming in that Mr. Gua was to pay a fine of almost $100 million within a few days. And that is what leads to a filing of bankruptcy. But the government's request that from that you draw the conclusion of guilt, again, is a misplaced request. The government will argue throughout this case that what Mr. Gua did was simply unlawful. They will ask you to say you can be persecuted and you can still be a fraud. And when they ask you that, I ask you to think about how the evidence shows them to be wrong. The government isn't just saying that there is a fraud. What the government is asking you to do is to conclude that Mr. Gua defrauded essentially himself because he is the movement, and the movement him. So when they ask you to take a look at the evidence that comes in, the evidence of wealth, the evidence of spending, the evidence of luxury, I ask you to evaluate all of that evidence in the context which I have described. And if you do so, and if you evaluate the evidence, understanding how difficult it was for these entities to survive, and how each one of the people who worked for these entities worked hard to maintain and forward a movement, you will reach the only logical conclusion in this case, that Mr. Gua is not guilty of the 12 counts of the indictment. Thank you.